konferencie Connected. Včera sme spolu hovorili o vzdelávaní k ľudským právam. Dneska v téme ľudských práv pokračujeme, ale v takej inej súvislosti. Dnešný deň alebo názov dnešného dňa konferencie je Connected Policies a na rozdiel od toho, ako sme včera hovorili skôr v tej praxi, to znamená, akým spôsobom vzdelávame, mali sme tu veľmi zaujímavé príklady zo špeciálnej školy z Islandu, mali sme tu príklady zo slovenských základných škôl, z Popradu, z Dolného Kubína a zo Smoleníc. Dneska budeme hovoriť skôr o takom systémovom nastavení. To znamená, že ako vlastne nastaviť verejné politiky, aby sme mohli vzdelávať k ľudským právam, aby to ľudskoprávne vzdelávanie malo svoju kvalitu a aby deti, ktoré prechádzajú týmto ľudskoprávnym vzdelávaním, si z neho odnášali čo najviac. Včera sme okrem tých inšpirácií, ktoré sem priniesli jednotliví prezentujúci, hovorili dosť veľa aj o tom, že niekedy ten proces prebieha ako keby napriek tomu systému. Že hľadáme priestor v tom systéme a snažíme sa uchmatnúť a vybabrať s tým systémom, aby sme mohli robiť to, čo je robiť treba. Teraz hovorím najmä o tom pohľade učiteľa, ale zároveň sme tu videli aj ten praktický príklad tých detí, tých študentov a študentiek, že naozaj z nich sršalo taký pocit, že áno, keď tá škola funguje inak, tak nás to baví. Je to pre nás zaujímavé, chceme sa učiť, zrazu dostávame väčšiu mieru zodpovednosti, je tam partnerstvo s učiteľom, môžeme participovať a to je to, čo robí ten rozdiel. Neunavuje nás to, ale baví nás to. Hovorili sme tu včera dosť veľa aj o takom širšom kontexte, že svet sa mení a momentálne sledujeme v celej západnej Európe alebo západnom svete vlnu narastajúceho populizmu, radikalizácie, vlnu odmietania určitých liberálnych hodnôt alebo štandardov liberálnej demokracie, na ktoré sme zvyknutí. Aj o tomto budeme hovoriť aj dnes. Aj ja sa dnes našich prezentujúcich budem na túto tému pýtať, aj keď možno trošku z iného pohľadu, ako to bolo včera. Táto konferencia je organizovaná nadáciou Otvorenej spoločnosti a je podporená prostredníctvom programu Demokracia a ľudské práva, ktorý realizuje nadácia Otvorená spoločnosť a je financovaný z finančných prostriedkov Európskeho hospodárskeho priestoru. Správne, tak to sa teším, lebo to som sa aj včera bál a dneska sa to podarilo. Našim prvým rečníkom dnes je Stener Ekern, ktorý bude hovoriť o ľudských právach ako zákon a demokratická hodnota a bude hovoriť o svojich skúsenostiach z Norska. Je doktorom sociálnej antropológie na univerzite v Oslo a okrem tej skúsenosti európskej má skúsenosti s touto témou aj v mnohých krajinách Latinskej Ameriky, Afriky a Ázie, na čo sa veľmi teším, lebo myslím si, že pri téme, ako je vzdelávanie k ľudským právam, je ten globálny kontext mimoriadne dôležitý. Takže odovzdávam teraz slovo jemu. Nech sa páči, priestor je váš.
Thank you so much. You can hear me? You can? Yeah, I hear myself too.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to the Open Society Foundation for this invitation and this great opportunity of talking about my work, and also my gratitude to all of you that are taking your time to come and listen to me. Here on the first slide you see my name and my vocation and my profession. Before I start to talk about human rights education and my perspectives on that, I would also like to say a few words about myself and my work and the work of my institution. You are all hearing me okay? It sounds very good. I think the technical part of the arrangement is just there. It's very good, yeah. A Norwegian and a Canadian citizen. I've been an anthropologist since I graduated as such in 1986 at the University of Bergen, which is the second largest city of Norway. But for the last 20 years I've been living in Oslo, the capital, and I've been working at the University of Oslo. But I also have worked in other types of business, even in factories, aluminium smelters, and in development cooperation, and also in the United Nations, in the Truth Commission in El Salvador, and that was, of course, a very profound experience. But for the last 20 years, I've been working at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights, which is a regular unit within the Faculty of Law at the University of Oslo, and that is the biggest and oldest university in Norway. There are several units within the Faculty of Law, and some of them are interdisciplinary, meaning that there are not only lawyers working there, but also people from other disciplines. And notably at the Institute of Criminology, they need sociologists and other social scientists in a way to understand how law is applied, things like that. And another such interdisciplinary unit is the Center for Human Rights, and let's say some 40% are lawyers, the rest of the staff, they are philosophers, political scientists, and one anthropologist, and that's me. This is what I'm going to, this is the structure of the lecture. But before entering into that, I also wanted to say something about being an anthropologist, because I think it's important, and also because I suppose in this country, as in most other countries, what anthropologists are doing today is a little different from the popular conception of anthropology. If we go 30, 40 years back, anthropology would be almost synonymous with ethnography. That is giving a description of a culture. And culture is, in popular understanding in Europe, most countries, almost synonymous with people or nation. People, nation, culture is the same thing. But is it? Why do we then have three different terms for it? So 40 years ago, if I were going to Slovakia in order to understand Slovak culture, I would perhaps make a kind of inventory of all the typical human rights that talk about human wrongs. Yes? So human rights culture of Slovakia would in a way be making a map of the violations taking place in Slovakia and deliver a report or saying something about what is typical of Slovakia. Yes, you follow this chain of logic, and I can assure you that in most countries in the world people tend to think that anthropology is giving descriptions like that. But I would rather say that anthropology today is about not the customs of people or their ways of life, but the focus is on how they produce meanings, how they give meanings to their customs, how this particular habit is in a way an expression of this or that meaning. So understanding human rights culture in Slovakia then would be understanding how Slovaks are using that term in order to capture or understand things, or in order to give moral justification to what they are doing and what they are not doing. Do you also follow that way of thinking? Anthropologists, they are studying the formulation of meaning, the way humans bestow meanings on what they are doing, and particularly what they are doing regularly in the form of customs or habits or ways of doing things. That is anthropology. So keep that in mind while we go through this lecture. And now the next slide, please. Yes, this is then what I intend to talk about. I will start out with human rights education as a political normative concept, that is the various definitions, the various intents at giving meaning to that word, so to speak. We're looking at various definitions inside the UN system, UNESCO, and the Council of Europe. And right from the start, This is not just any education, it is human rights education. After having gone through the definitions, the conceptual side, I will start with and take a look at what we are actually doing in practice. And this is where the anthropologist is awakening. What are we meaning? What are we really referring to when we use strange words like human rights education? What are we doing in practice with this? And then, with that in mind, we'll take a closer look at the case of Norway, the way human rights is being used and not used in society at large and in school. And then that case of Norway will be a case of how human rights is used and applied and understood and given meaning in Norway. But this is not in the main purpose is not to teach you about Norway. The main purpose is to see that Norway is just one case of applying this. And it can be and it will be necessarily applied in many different ways in all countries. And that will lead into the final discussion, which is to what extent human rights as a concept, human rights education, really can be transported from one country to the next just like that, as you sometimes are tempted to believe if you listen to international diplomats. They think that anything can just be exported from one country to the next, and I don't think it's that easy. So that's in a way the bottom line of this lecture. Yes, and then let us start. And these are the definitions that we see around in international documents. And I can read them, and I encourage you to read them. It is bureaucratic, diplomatic language and talk, but it has meaning. There is this meaning that was originally there when this text was born out of several days of negotiations between diplomats from many different countries, including Slovakia and Norway. And it is the meaning that is formed in our mind when we are reading the text. So let's look at, in a way, the most authoritative text, that is the UN Treaty, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. In Article 26 it says, education, and then they mean, I suppose, any education, all the things we do in order to turn children into adults. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality, nothing less, and to the strengthening of respect for human rights. So right from the start, as teachers, as educators, as adults, as citizens, we have a responsibility for strengthening the respect of human rights. And fundamental freedoms, which is a synonym for human rights in many ways. Education, then, shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial and religious groups. So, in a way, by the mere fact of being a citizen or an inhabitant of any country, if your country has ratified these treaties, this is the law. Yeah. Even though it takes the form of a claim or wishful thinking or whatever, it is the law, ipso facto, by the mere fact of having been recognized by a government. This Article 26 is then given a more full explanation in the Treaty on Social and Economic Rights in Article 13, and it goes like this. The state parties, that is those who signed or those who ratified, the actors in international politics, when they sign these documents, they are called state parties in diplomatic language. They further agree that education shall enable all persons to participate effectively in a free society and further the activities of the UN for the maintenance of peace. So we start in a way, when we become citizens, an adult and responsible person, we start with all that burden on our shoulders. We are going to strengthen respect for human rights. We are going to contribute to the development of the human personality. And moreover, we agree that these things we call education, they shall enable persons to participate effectively in a free society. And also we shall always be at the service of the United Nations. Yeah, this is a kind of interpretation as you go. In order to help us understand what these texts are saying, there is a whole lot of so-called general comments given by the committees that are responsible for helping the state parties to implement these texts in their own countries. So the general comments, they are a kind of distilled wisdom of all the representatives on these various international committees. And it is meant as a help, as a support to governments and ordinary people to understand what is really behind those words. And there are such general comments to all the articles, and I return to that very shortly. And for helping us to understand Article 13, the general comment is, it goes like this, that human rights can only be achieved through an informed and continued demand by people for their protection. So we give a little more meat to these claims about that education shall be directed to the full development. Here it says that this is necessary. Human rights can only be achieved if people in a way are aware of them and demanding their implementation all the time. So this is a virtuous circle of demand from people and their governments. Human rights really is about creating decent and good government. A return to that. So this is explaining why. Human rights can only be achieved through an informed and continued demand by people for their protection. Human rights education promotes values, beliefs, and attitudes that encourage all individuals to uphold their own rights and those of others. It's not only me, it is us, and all of us. It develops an understanding of everyone's common responsibility to make human rights a reality in each community. And as I already have implied, this is law both for Slovaks and Norwegians and Icelanders and all of us, yes. This is too fast. Can we go back to the first? Because I wanted to say, and after also having listened to what happened the 2 preceding days, I want to use 5 minutes in explaining the basics of human rights. Yes, it is an idea about creating a good society, but it is more than that. I will give some more details later, but one of the things I do at the Norwegian Center for Human Rights is being responsible for a master's program in the theory and practice of human rights. And we receive every year 20-25 students from all over the world, including Slovakia. And when I welcome my students as a social scientist to an introductory course in human rights, there is another introductory course which is given by lawyers, and it is this course given by myself and philosophers and historians. And I start out, what are human rights? And people have very different answers, although they tend to narrow down. 20 years ago, there was more guessing about this. Today, it is narrowing down. People are getting more precise when they define it, but perhaps also they lose a little of their creativity and fantasy. All teachers will recognize what I say, I suppose. Anyway, but then I try to say that human rights, yes, it's this, and you are right, you have a point there. And then I say that it is at least 3 different things. When we talk about human rights here at this program, when we talk about human rights in the world, we refer at least to 3 different clusters or categories of ideas. And the first one is, in a way, the legal one, the lawyer's definition, and it's simple, and I think also it's basic, and I think we as an anthropologist, I must admit it, they have a point. It's important to keep a mind on the fact that human rights, concretely, is that branch, that part of international law that refers to the relationship between the government and the people living under their jurisdiction or on their territory. Yes? It is international law, but it is not that part of international law that deals with air traffic or economic transactions or whatever, but it is that part that deals with the relations, with the rules of citizenship, etc., and the establishment of public services, etc., inside a nation state. Because today, almost everyone on the planet, they live in a nation state. They live in nation states. And this is not necessarily the natural condition, even if we may think it is. But there are very, very few people living outside a nation state today. So in a way then, human rights is about that part of the law that regulates our relation with the local government. That is one definition. Another definition would be that human rights, it's about, to put it a bit sloppily, it's about being good. Yes? It's about doing good things. It's about being a good member of the community and contribute to having a good community. So it's, in a way, it's a kind of moral philosophy. And that corresponds to the popular understanding in Norway. Human rights, it is about having good government, it's about having a good society, it's about enjoying welfare, enjoying entitlements, enjoying good life, enjoying the freedoms of expression, freedoms of this and freedoms of that. And people in Norway, they tend to think that this is something that we were born with. And that is, of course, a reference to this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. People actually believe that they were born with rights. But of course, when we talk about this general welfare or this general happiness or whatever, we can also do that without making any reference to rights. Why do we dress up this in the costume of obligation and rights? Why do we accept this legal ordering of social life? Well, our states have decided that it is to be so. So human rights is, as a political philosophy, it's about thinking about good government in terms of rights and obligations and defining all social life as the result of contractual arrangements between a government and its citizens. And to each right then corresponds a scope, an area that is regulated by this right, and there you have this right to education. It is saying that society thinks that all kinds of education or teaching or formation of young people is to be thought of as a contract between the government and the parents and the children for receiving education. And in Norway, this has gone to the extreme that if you want to have instruction in this or that language at a public school, this is thought of as a right, and you can only be given if there are teachers capable of doing that, and if there are a sufficient number of pupils for having that particular course on that school, etc., etc. And that is in a way obvious, but all this is framed in rights speak, so that young pupils, students in Norway, they talk about their rights, their rights, their rights, their rights all the time, and the adults and old people like me, we are growing a little tired of this, but that's how it is. You follow me? So, human rights, it is a set of rules for states for ensuring that they behave in a decent way as against their citizens, but it is also a set of ideas about how to order justly the social space in which we live. And sometimes when we talk about human rights, we are not very sure about what we are talking about. And this, of course, causes misunderstandings all the time. Yes? Then we can have the next slide, and then we'll go further on this definition thing. And we can take a look at what the Council of Europe says. You know that in addition to the big treaties that are administered by the United Nations, the big treaties about human rights, the big treaties about political and civil rights on the one hand, and the economic, social and cultural rights on the other hand, and the whole range of other treaties about this and that and this and that obliges all states to behave decently and according with this text. In addition to this international system, on several continents, they have a regional human rights instrument in addition to that, and in Europe, then we have this European Declaration of Human Rights, the European Charters. And these charters are administered by the Council of Europe, and the Council of Europe has this to say about education. Education plays an essential role in the promotion of the core values of the Council of Europe: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Education is increasingly seen as a defense against the rise of violence, racism, extremism, xenophobia, discrimination, and intolerance. And here, in a way, it is narrowing down. We are talking more specifically, we are talking more concretely. But you can see that what the Council of Europe is saying is derived from these overarching texts, talking about preparing people for living in free society and respect for other nations. If we are going to achieve that, we must do things like that. So this is getting more specific as we go down. And this will be the definitions and words that apply most directly to us as Europeans. Of course, we are bound by what the United Nations are saying, but more specifically by what the European authorities are saying. And moreover, generally, this human rights law in Europe is more positivized, as lawyers say. That is meaning that they can be applied directly by national courts in the respective countries. And here I also should add that the texts that I give here, they are not always having the status of being a legal text for a lawyer in Slovakia or in Norway. It's rather in the category of so-called soft law. Have you heard that expression? I mean, it's in opposition to hard law. Hard law is what is on the books. It is what sends people to prison, yes? Because a judge is successfully cataloging what you have done as a violation of this or that rule. These rules are not that hard. They cannot be used that directly, but they are supposed to form the general background on which positive law is built. You follow this logic? I'm talking about education. The European system, they have elaborated a very, very detailed text about these activities, and you can find it there on this web link that I have given. And in addition, if you enter the web pages of the Council of Europe, you will have access to all these things, of course. And as you browse through these pages, you will also find some attempts at explaining these texts for ordinary people who are not that familiar with the legal way of thinking. And you may find citations like this. For instance, children and young people may not be old enough to vote in elections or sit on juries, but even so, They have rights and duties, and they are entitled to have a say. And this is, of course, a way of popularizing the Convention on the Rights of the Child. You see, you follow this logic. This Charter on Education for Democratic Citizenship and Human Rights Education, this is the abbreviation, teaches them skills they need for school and family life whilst giving them knowledge for the future. And surely there were some classically trained European looking at these things as he or she was sitting and writing them, and suddenly it occurred to him or her this old citation from one of the founders, we imagine, of European culture, Aristotle, who said that if liberty and equality, as is thought by some, are chiefly to be found in democracy, they will be best attained when all persons alike share in the government to the utmost. And that's, in a way, another way of saying the same thing. It is this idea that the best society is a democratic society, and a democratic society is a society where as many people as possible participate as informedly as possible. Yes? So we're coming back to where we started in a way. And then let us go on. And I'm narrowing down. I'm trying to be ever more concrete about what we mean with human rights education. Now we have been talking about the goals and what is it that we are trying to achieve. Another authoritative text that can help us in concretizing this is the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training. This is also a soft law document. It is not directly applicable in every single member country of the United Nations system, but all governments are in a way supposed to work in that spirit. And this declaration in Article 2, it says that human rights education is education about human rights, which includes providing knowledge and understanding of human rights norms and principles, the values that underpin them, as well as the mechanisms for their protection. And that is, in a way, what I tried to get across very briefly at the start. It is saying that human rights education shall at least include a minimum description of the international human rights system as a law. I mean, it says that students, pupils everywhere, they should know that there is such thing as the UN system, and this UN system has a series of treaties saying that all citizens in all countries have rights as against the governments, etc., etc. And this system is a series of treaties, and all the governments, they ratify them, which means that it is now binding also domestically. And the hidden premise is, of course, that in this system, the principal agent responsible for implementing this on the national level is the government of that country. The UN system is there not as a policeman, but rather as a teacher. Yes, if you follow me, the whole point of the UN system is in a way to offer to each government professional help in implementing this. So about human rights is understanding how this is built up. But it also refers to education through human rights, which includes learning and teaching in a way that respects the rights of both educators and learners. And that is, in a way, what we were talking very much about yesterday. Human rights education was, in a way, immediately being interpreted as a particular pedagogical tradition or a particular way of transmitting knowledge and forming young people, and perhaps particularly those young people who are handicapped in one way or another in terms of dominant culture in a society. So we are supposed to learn this about the system. We are supposed to learn it in a way that gives equal participation to everyone and equal opportunities to everyone. And so that refers to the way we arrange the transmission of that knowledge, so to speak. And finally, it is education for human rights, and we were also having many examples of that yesterday. It includes empowering persons to enjoy and exercise their rights and to respect and uphold the rights of others. So when we give human rights education to people who are in one way or another not on the same level playing ground as others, the intention also is to lift them up so that they are able to enjoy that equality. So human rights education are all those things. So that's on paper. So now let's go to practice. I have said that human rights education is both a thing to be taught and a way of teaching. It is both a goal and a method. And so what is actually happening then around the world in the many countries, in the 200 or 208, I think, territories that are considered kind of, if not nation states, at least a proto-nation state across the world today. And then we will observe that in many countries some variety of human rights education already is a part of ordinary curriculums and at all levels. Typically in a nation state like Norway, there will be references to human rights in history, not overt, not explicit, but there will be references to how Norwegians have tried to establish a just government. In the history lessons, for instance, there will be the history of national political institutions, the ethos of the people. There will be references to human rights in social science, about democratic politics, about civics, citizenship formation, and what is known in the Spanish-speaking world as educación cívica. And that is the part of the world that I know best in addition to Scandinavia, of course. So I constantly refer to it in order to create a kind of basis for comparison all the time. This is educación cívica. In the United States, it's referred to as civics. In Norway, it may typically be referred to as samfunnslære, that is social science. I saw in last week there is a young Dutch researchers with us, and in the Netherlands this is referred to as basic social rights. It is not, human rights are not mentioned, but basic social rights is there. So when we talk about human rights, remember that we have many ideas about just government. And we must use all of them if we are in a way to use the resources that are also there in the students, among the students. So in this way, human rights education typically appears indirectly in curriculum all over the world, all over the world's nation states. It is rare to find this in the form of specific learning goals. Rather, human rights or references to human rights typically appears in preambles. The purpose of this law is to, and this law is anchored in human rights, it says. For instance, in this statute that regulates teaching schools, teacher academies in Norway, there is a reference to human rights. Everything is supposed to be anchored in human rights, and everyone is supposed to promote human rights, but there is no specific course on human rights, and that's a general point. So it's there in the preambles, or they typically arise in particular situations of discrimination or bullying or anything, and then human rights is referred to as a kind of moral superior law that we must apply on this situation in order to be good judges and in order to turn this situation into a good learning example for everyone. Then the teacher is pulling this human rights out of his hat. But he has had no particular training in the system as such. That is the situation in Scandinavia, generally. So in this way, human rights becomes a thing that is taken for granted, but we really do not know whether we take the same things for granted. Yes, you see this point. It is assumed that human rights is something that belongs to the realm of ideas, in contrast to positive law. The school may have a statute or rule that regulates what is happening in the schoolyard, but when the actual conflict comes, it is solved by reference to human rights, for instance, because human rights is being good and just. And my grandfather, he would do this by reference to the Bible or the Ten Commandments. And not directly, but it would be the same idea about an ideal ordering of things we can find in the Bible. Today we can find them in human rights. But in both cases, we haven't read the original texts, or only very rarely have we actually read the texts. But in addition to this, human rights, of course, exist in most countries in the form of special courses, and that is why I'm here. It is about human rights as a legal framework, and in this way, a set of rules, and I already told you about government. And we tend to think that here it's particularly relevant for particular groups of government employees. That is the police, military personnel, health personnel, in areas where the state is particularly bound by international law. So in many countries you will find that actually the police, they will be the people in that country that are most specifically trained in human rights, but that doesn't mean that they are better than others in their behavior. But they will be the people who actually have read the human rights texts in many countries. And that is in line with this thinking that human rights is generally over there. It's not necessary to explain it. But, the police, this is a very special representative of the state that they have to behave in accordance with the rules in international law. And then finally at university level, and the center where I work is an example, of course. We teach human rights theory. We teach about the international human rights system, the mechanisms, the lists of rights, contemporary issues, how to promote them, etc. So then I think it's time for the next slide. And this is saying, in a way, what I tried to say already on the previous slide, but in a more systematic, learned, analytic way. Human rights education is typically used in many countries as an implementation strategy for development or democratization generally. And that would be the case for most countries here in what we used to call Eastern Europe, those countries that were under communist domination for a decade or various decades. Human rights, in a way, suddenly appeared as a way of helping us to build more democratic societies, as a part of a kind of development or transformation strategy. I'm not very much an expert on that transition, but I have participated in similar transitions in Central America, for instance, where also human rights entered actual social and educational life as an implementation strategy for development or democratization. So a country like Guatemala, for instance, even though Guatemala participated in the elaboration of this system during the 50s and 60s, it was always more or less a dictatorship. And after a civil war, human rights, references to human rights were used to give more concrete work strategies for how to reform society in a way that would prevent this civil war from occurring one more time. And typically human rights then in Guatemala and many other Latin American countries, they were used for transforming a police and a military that were known for violating human rights. It was thought that when they receive schooling and education in human rights, they will become a better police and a better military, etc., etc. So there were literally hundreds of experts from all over the world coming to Guatemala, traveling around the country and giving courses in human rights to police and to the military, and also to ordinary people in various community sectors. It was all over. It was in a way strange. I think in many ways that many ordinary people in Guatemala, they have received more of a course in human rights than they have in Norway. And there is this famous anecdote. There was a general strike on the city bus transport system in Guatemala in, I think it was in 1999. And the city was, of course, paralyzed, and people were worrying how to get to work, etc., etc. And then the radio television is outside in the streets interviewing people. And this strike was not very popular for that reason, of course. And so the journalist is talking with the bus ticket vendor on the bus in Guatemala. There are still two people on each bus, one driving and another selling tickets. And then the journalist asked this ticket seller about the strike, how long are you going to strike, etc., etc. And he is a little embarrassed. He knows that he is not popular. So he hastened to say, but we have done a course in human rights. So then it was okay. Not yet, yeah. I wanted to say something more. So human rights is used in development and democratization. It is also used to provide a legal perspective on the issue at hand. That is to learn to analyze a situation in terms of rights holders, duty bearers, and the scope of the right, for clarifying welfare obligations. And that is what is taught at a specific course for policemen or welfare officers in a government agency, that human rights is about seeing the client as a rights holder and thinking of yourselves as not only a government agent or a powerful man or woman, but also to think of yourself as a duty bearer. You have a duty to take the rights holder seriously and give him or her the attention that follows from this right. It's about learning, in a way, how to operate a government administration. And we can use it as a strategy for the empowerment of discriminated or otherwise vulnerable groups, and we were having many examples yesterday. And I also should add that human rights education is used in many examples as a kind of emancipatory or even alternative pedagogy. It's a vision of equality and freedom. And here, if you consult human rights education on Wikipedia, for instance, or in other books like that, you will find that there will be pointers to radical pedagogical alternatives like the Summerhill schools in England, etc., etc. So there's a whole continuum of pedagogical practices that we can classify as human rights education if we want. But when we do that, be aware that that way of thinking about Summerhill schools, for instance, may not be shared by everyone. So human rights education is also a very diffuse and slippery concept. It can be used to justify almost anything. If you also consult articles about models of human rights education, you will find more analytical discussions about the pedagogical aspects. So, according to some people, human rights education can be thought of, or one branch of human rights education can be imagined as following a values and awareness model, and that is particularly the case in civic education, the learning of social citizenship, the learning of solidarity and loyalty. You can say that human rights education is teaching good social values, good societal values. It is teaching solidarity and loyalty within the national unit that you live. Or you can think of human rights education as following an accountability model. And that is in a way what would be the case in a police academy in Guatemala. I had the experience of evaluating human rights courses at the police academy in Guatemala. And there they follow this accountability model. It was teaching each policewoman and man, giving him or her an understanding that you are now administering the law, you are now a representative of the Guatemalan government, you have to behave decently, and you have to do this because you are accountable, because we want you to be accountable for what you are doing all the time. Yes? So this is another way of thinking about human rights education. And finally, this transformational model, which is the same as I started out with, it's human rights education is thought of as an instrument for not only forming but reforming a society. So it's a long history, it's a project of civilization in many ways. We tend to think that creating modern nation states is creating civilized society, and it's the same as creating them in the image of human rights. But that history, of course, is very, very long, and if we go 2,000 years back, the thing that we call human rights would perhaps be thought of in terms of things like virtue. Yes? But at the same time, this is often contentious in many countries. This also must be stressed. For instance, in Spain, 15 years ago, the then socialist Spanish government, they wanted to use human rights education more actively in educación cívica, in the civics education, and they wanted to base this idea about being a good and productive Spanish citizen on these European human rights derived definitions. But they did that without consulting the other big party in Spain, and without consulting the church, and without consulting many other good, not necessarily good, but powerful, important actors in Spanish society. So when the next government came, they just revoked this law, and today Spain is without any particular law in this field. And the arguments, the counter-arguments against this, the argument against basing social citizenship on human rights specifically, was that, and in Spain, of course, much education is private in the sense that it is administered by the Catholic Church. And the argument was that when the state is doing this, the state takes the responsibility for the moral education that should belong with the parents, the church, and civil society, and not the state. So there are debates here all the time. In other countries, you may hear that this is a secularizing, and it's a Western project. It is promoting individualism. It is promoting contract thinking. and it is in a way a disguise for Western imperialism. And this is also an argument you hear all over the world when the state assumes responsibility for learning how to be a good citizen. It is penetrating the territory of the parents. And of course, inside human rights themselves, there is this dynamics or tensions between the right of the parent to instruct the child the way you want and the right of that child to become independent, including of the parents. This is a perennial debate, and it is not resolved. It is no final answer to that inside the system of human rights, but it's rather a recipe for resolving that conflict in a peaceful and dynamic and creative way. So then we go on, and I see that I use my time now, but I try to go through the rest too. I was talking about giving Norway as an example. And then the first thing to know is that, yes, human rights, it is international law, but international law is not automatically valid inside Norway, because Norway is a dual legal system. Meaning that before an international law can become national law in Norway, it has to be approved by the local parliament. And most Norwegians, they think that it has always been so. But that is not true, of course. If we go 150 years back, foreign policy, international treaties, agreements, it was the prerogative of the crown. It was not the parliament who did such things. So that is one reason why in many countries international law are automatically also national law if it has been ratified by the sovereign. And that is the case in the Netherlands, for instance. That is the case in most Latin American countries. That is the case in the United States. But not in Norway. I don't know about Slovakia, but I would believe today it is dual. But I'm not sure. I should have checked it, of course. And this is why debates about human rights in Norway is debates about what to put in the constitution or not. Because international law is not automatically part of the constitution. It has to be in the constitution. And this constitution that we have, that is very old, it was amended 2 years ago, and now there is specific mentioning of human rights, but only 2 years ago. That said, next element here is in understanding what Norway is doing and not is doing, that Norway is a signatory to most human rights treaties, and it is an active member of the United Nations and the Council of Europe, and the mere fact that we are here today is a concretization of that policy. And Norway also has on the domestic level a quite well-established network of ombudsman institutions. There is a parliamentary ombud for the public administration since 1962 already. There is one for children, there is one for equality and anti-discrimination. So all these things here, they were already a regular part, or this intent at watching what the administration is doing, putting it under a kind of independent supervision. It was already there before we started to implement these international rules. So in a way, we already had several practices for, in a way, achieving the same ends as the Council of Europe is encouraging all member states to do. And that is an important detail, because I will return to that. And then we have the next slide. Talking more about human rights implementation in Norway, it has been promoted actively since the late 1970s in 3 government white papers, as well as by a growing community of NGOs. And since around 1990, human rights then has become a trump card in public debate, the way I tried to illustrate in the beginning of my lecture. I mean, if you make a reference to the human rights is the ultimate value. If you say that this is against my human rights, then it's full stop. Yes? So people use it popularly as our grandfathers used the Bible. That is what we have in Norway. So it's also generally imagined as a part of our values, as opposed to political dictatorship and theocratic and patriarchal rule. It is identical to democracy and rule of law, rettsstat in Norwegian. And furthermore, typically then Norwegians, they imagine human rights that is identical to what we have already, so it's not necessary to learn more about it. And it's identical to what is lacking out there in the poor and developing world, or the world that is ravaged by war, or the world that have very different and strange cultures. They don't have human rights, and that's that. So all this is going into the formulation of popular ideas about human rights in Norway. And I'm saying this to exemplify where we have to start, or where I have to start when I teach human rights in Norway. I have to be aware of the specifics of the popular conception of the word. But Norwegians, they will, of course, admit that we have some problems too with discrimination and cases of injustice and treatment of particularly vulnerable groups. But those are minor issues in a way. Norwegians think. The next. This is saying the same, but from another perspective. I said it entered the national political agenda through a series of white papers. Norway has ratified all these treaties. Human rights started to enter the popular consciousness together with the end of the Cold War and the Helsinki process. Human rights in many ways is the new utopia. And it's part of the general globalization process. And this happened, and the way I understand it is that there was a realization in the political elite of Norway, and in particular in the Social Democratic Party, that tends to think of itself as the natural ruler of Norway. Human rights, they were on the rise on the international agenda, and it is of benefit to small countries. And this is also a thing about Norway. We are intensely aware of the fact that we are a very small country with 5.5 million people and not very much meat to throw around. So the stronger the international institutions are, the better our prospects for surviving as such is. In a well-regulated international system, it is very, very difficult for the big powers to mess around. That is a cornerstone in Norwegian policy, and that is also one reason why human rights is adopted so eagerly by Norwegian diplomacy and the Norwegian elite. Yeah, we can take the next slide. And then we come to ourselves, and I shall not use much time on this. I suppose that the PowerPoint will be distributed after the lecture. This is just saying, if time permitted, that we are a unit of the Faculty of Law, etc., and that we give this course in human rights. And you can read everything about the course there. And it should also be mentioned that human rights is a compulsory subject. There are 2 mandatory courses also for ordinary lawyers in Norway. 30 years ago, it would be possible to become a lawyer in Norway without knowing anything about human rights. That is no longer possible. Everyone has to learn a little. Next. Yeah, I think this will be the second to last slide. This is about implementing human rights in Norway. I gave you the analytical, the factual history. Now we are entering in a way where public debate is going now. And I have tried to explain that human rights in Norway typically is thought of as a set of ideas, an argument that we use in debates to promote this or that argument. And this is in debates about discrimination of special, vulnerable or weak groups, women, the gender question, children, ethnic and religious minorities, in debates about unequal opportunities or distribution of welfare. I say that even if we do not know very much about the international system of human rights law, we refer to human rights when we argue in favor of a better gender balance, better treatment of children, whatever. We make references all the time to human rights, even though we are not very sure about what we are talking about. Now, in some fields, there seems to be mismatch between the Norwegian idea about human rights and what is actually laid down as human rights by the European Court in Strasbourg. And this is the areas where Norway is voted against them in Strasbourg, where Norway is losing cases in Strasbourg. And that is cases that involve the Child Protection Agency, which is either too active, too quick in taking children from their families, or they are too slow, letting fathers and mothers destroy their children completely. There are cases, there are examples of both things, of course. I suppose that's the case in any country. But in Norway, those who feel that they have been too active, they have on several occasions gone to Strasbourg, and generally Strasbourg have ruled in favor of the parents against the state, which is, of course, Central and Southern European thinking generally will give more authority to parents at the cost of the state. But in Sweden and Norway, it's the other way around. So this is also part of creating Europe as a mainstreaming process. And the other big field where Norway is regularly ruled against is that we tend to give undue preference to the state church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Norway, in the school system. Very much of what is called civic education, etc., in other countries, it will be given in classes about religion in Norway. And this is an affront for many, many parents, and regularly parents, they take their cases to the UN or to Strasbourg, and also regularly the Norwegian government is losing, and they are tinkering a little on the law, and then after the next election, the powerful Christian Democratic Party is able to turn back this adjustment of the law, and in that way they are retaining their power over school the way it is done by their colleagues, so to speak, in Spain. Those debates are going on all the time, and the rest there you see other areas where Norwegian government is losing their cases and where we have problems. And then we'll have a quick look at the last slide. If you can move forward to the last slide, transporting human rights education. 1, 2, 3 slides. Next. Next. Here we are. The next. Here it is. So the core of my message has been, in a way, that human rights, it refers to a core of ideas about human dignity and just rule, with associated institutional state practices as defined by your own actually existing context. So, and all these ideas, they are concretized in a series of treaties and texts and associated best practices, and are defined by the United Nations and the Council of Europe as education about international human rights law and educating through human rights, in the sense of treating all teachers and students as holders of rights, etc., etc. But because these ideas are so fussily defined, they will vary from one country to the next, so that you cannot do it in your own country without also knowing about the context into which these ideas are transported. So that's the way I try to do it in Norway, and the conclusion then must be that I encourage you to do the same in Slovakia. It is not only a case of learning about what the books are saying, it is also a case of trying to understand what is happening when you are transporting these ideas into a local context with local understandings. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. Ďakujem veľmi pekne za vašu veľmi zaujímavú prednášku. Nemáme veľa času na otázky, ale ak máte nejaké, ktoré chcete položiť, tak teraz je ten priestor. Ja jednu otázku mám, tak zatiaľ možno porozmýšľajte a premyslite si. Vo svojej prednáške ste veľa hovorili o kontexte, ktorý musíme brať do úvahy, keď hovoríme o ľudských právach a ich implementácii. Hovorili sme o tom exporte alebo transporte ľudských práv. Keď som rozmýšľal nad Norskom, zamýšľal som sa nad tým, že ten kontext sa mení aj v rámci krajiny. Niekedy sa mení veľmi turbulentne a vplývajú na ňo vonkajšie vplyvy, ktoré musíme pri tej implementácii alebo prehodnocovaní to, akým spôsobom pristupujeme k ľudským právom, brať do úvahy. Napadá ma v poslednom období možno také dve veľmi výrazné udalosti, ktoré sa vo vašej krajine stali. To je migrantská vlna, ktorá prišla do Norska, a to je možno prípad teroristického útoku Breivika, že do akej miery aj z vášho pohľadu tieto dve udalosti prispeli vlastne k nejakému prerámcovaniu toho kontextu implementácie ľudských práv v Norsku.
Mm-hmm. Both those situations, events, they have a heavy influence on what is taking place on domestic debate, of course. The interesting thing for me is, of course, the way both sides in that debate is making references to human rights. And that is a good thing, because it means that all of us respect human rights. Those that are, in a way, popularly seen as against immigration, they are saying that they are against uncontrolled immigration in order to keep up and maintain the asylum institute. And of course they have a point. This asylum institute was not designed for receiving 30,000 newcomers in a few months. There is administrative capacity, but there is also, of course, this cultural unease. And the debate about the cultural unease is a lot more difficult to follow, because it tends to hide, because it's shameful. So yes, there is a debate, and on the one hand there are those that says it is a human obligation, it's a moral obligation to receive as many as possible, because these people, they are suffering and it's really bad, and 100 years ago we were perhaps going to other countries for the same reasons, so we just have to do it. Moreover, we are complying with human rights when we do it. And then on the other hand, there are those people who are wary of all these newcomers. They think it will be too much. What will happen to our schools? What will happen to Norwegian culture? Because all these newcomers, they don't respect those values, etc., etc. And we must control it. And moreover, when we control it, we ensure that only those that really deserve it are accepted, and all the free riders we have to reject. Mm-hmm. That is how human rights is used in debates about migration. About the terrorist threat, again, it is a case of human rights appearing on both sides of the debate. But there the debate is less intensive. It seems to me, and then of course I appear as a human rights liberal, I'm a bit wary of how much personal data is used not only by police and military, but security police, but also by private companies. And Facebook is a fantastic example where I am a bit nervous about the future. So then I use arguments from human rights, the articles about privacy, the right to a private life, etc., and to be protected from undue interference. But on the other hand, they will say, but you don't have any life at all. If there is a terrorist coming up the next day and bombing your place, then you won't have any life anymore. So, and human rights is also about protecting the collective group in which we live. So both things are there.
Myslím, že takto tá debata prebieha vo viacerých krajinách v súčasnosti. Ja nechám teraz priestor, tam vidím jednu otázku. Poprosím vás, nepripomínal som to ešte dnes, ale keď chcete položiť otázku, počkajte na mikrofón, aby sme vedeli zabezpečiť preklad. Nech sa páči.
Dobrý deň, ja som Dana Rušinová z nadácie pre deti Slovenska a zároveň tu reprezentujem aj Koalíciu pre deti Slovensko, ktorej členom je aj organizátor tejto dnešnej konferencie. Našim cieľom v koalícii je práve presadzovať a hovoriť o právach detí na Slovensku. Je to téma všeobecne celkom nová. Myslím, jej implementácia v praxi nielen na Slovensku, ale aj v Európe a možno aj vo svete. Ja by som chcela len potvrdiť vaše slová na základe našich výskumov a skúseností, čo sa týka toho ľudskoprávneho vzdelávania detí a mladých ľudí, že naozaj nedá sa hovoriť a vzdelávať o ľudských právach detí a mladých ľudí, pokiaľ celý ten spôsob učenia ľudských práv tie deti naozaj nezažívajú v tej škole. Že je veľmi dôležité, aby celé školské prostredie, celý ten spôsob vzdelávania tých detí už vychádzal z toho, že sa rešpektujú ich práva, ich základné práva. A pretože deti sa najefektívnejšie učia práve zážitkom a skúsenosťou. A pokiaľ deti v tom svojom dennom kontakte s učiteľmi, s tými dôležitými dospelými, samozrejme tá rodina je na prvom mieste, ale potom aj ďalšie prostredie, ako v nemocniciach napríklad, u lekárov a tak ďalej, vnímajú to, že oni ako deti a tie ich detské práva, ktoré sú ešte trošku odlišné od tých všeobecných ľudských práv, sú zo strany tých dospelých, ktorí sú ich vzormi, alebo mali by byť naozaj rešpektované, naplňané, tak myslím si, že až vtedy naozaj potom už to ľudskoprávne vzdelávanie bude skutočne efektívne, pretože oni už budú vedieť, ako tie práva žiť a rešpektovať potom už aj v tej dospelosti. A v tejto súvislosti, ešte možno pre vašu informáciu, nielen naša nadácia, ale mnoho neziskových organizácií na Slovensku naplňa aj takéto tretie, čo vy ste hovorili, že učenie pre ľudské práva. A naozaj máme mnohé vzdelávacie programy pre rôznych profesionálov tu na Slovensku, kde my podporujeme a pomáhame v podstate štátu v tom, aby sme štátnych úradníkov a iných profesionálov naozaj vzdelávali, my konkrétne naša nadácia, o potrebách, právach detí a ostatní kolegovia teda o právach zase rôznych iných skupín. A v tejto súvislosti ja by som mala takú konkrétnu otázku, že či je dohovor o právach dieťaťa nejakým špecifickým predmetom vzdelávania učiteľov, respektíve iných profesionálov v Norsku, a či sa aj deti v rámci ľudskoprávneho vzdelávania zvlášť vzdelávajú o dohovore o právach dieťaťa. Ďakujem.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. But first I would like to say that I very much agree with what you started out with, that educating children is a process of letting the child gradually acquire the autonomy needed for being a responsible adult citizen, etc., and how to do that. I recognize that very much from my own country too, and this debate is not only taking place inside schools or institutions, it is also taking place in any home with my own children. Yeah. This Declaration on the Rights of the Child, it is the UN Declaration that has received the biggest number of signatories. I mean, who dares being against the rights of children? That's impossible. So consequently, there is no state that can say no openly. In Norway, it is now, thanks to this constitutional reform 2 years ago, part of the constitution. But even so, it cannot be applied directly in courts. It has to be given the format of a Norwegian law. So Norwegian judges, they are only recently making direct references to this. And they are jealously guarding the constitutional independence of Norway, so they are reluctant to use international law directly. They have to be told so. That's the formal thing. As for contents, which is, after all, I think the most important thing, for the moment what happens is that all the associations and federations and organizations in civil society that work with children, they, of course, they have included it. And they work in favor of this all the time in order to pressure the case as against the state that sometimes is violating these rights or in complying. And slowly it appears also on the curriculum of various social studies and child agency formation, but it's still not compulsory. It's typically there in the preamble. Everybody has to respect it, but when it comes to actual cases, the picture is different. And there is a debate this week exactly there are journalists and some people working at the relevant schools that are debating the quality of the child agency services, and it appears that only one of 15 or 20 schools where you can obtain such education, only one of them give specific courses in human rights. In the rest, it remains in the preambles.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne, veľmi ma to mrzí, ale náš čas vypršal, takže ešte raz ďakujem vám veľmi pekne za veľmi zaujímavú prednášku a myslím si, že zostávate tu s nami ešte počas dnešného programu, tak budete mať určite príležitosť počas tých neformálnych častí konferencie sa niečo spýtať alebo si dovysvetliť niečo možno, čo nebolo povedané. Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you so much.